Good afternoon. I'm Alex Stock. I'm the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And I'm really happy to be here today. And thank you all for coming. The Thompson Center has really been delighted to be able to sponsor today's event on fiscal policy challenges facing the next administration. I want to thank our speaker, Mike Murphy, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the La Follette School, the Departments of Political Science, Economics, and Sociology for their support, as well as Ruth and Mary Kate at the Thompson Center. Let me briefly explain what the Thompson Center is for those who are unfamiliar. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues from both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. And seeking to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy, the Thompson Center works to foster effective public leadership by sponsoring events such as today's, funding research and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the UW system. It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Murphy. Mike is Senior Vice President and Chief of Staff for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and Director of FixUs. Mike received his bachelor's degree in History and Political Science from SUNY Albany and his Master's of Public Administration and Certificate of Health Services Management and Policy from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Mike has a long career in public policy, including experience on Capitol Hill in legislative affairs for the American Cancer Society and senior analyst for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey and for the Come Back America initiative, whose mission is to educate and engage the public about federal, state, and local fiscal issues. In his current role at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Mike manages policy research and analysis on a variety of topics and coordinates a wide variety of projects advancing the committee's policy-related initiatives. He also directs FixUs, a special initiative of the committee that seeks to understand and address the root causes of the growing divisions and dysfunction in American politics today. Please welcome Mike Murphy.
Thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for giving some of your precious time to come and hear about the federal budget, okay? You are a unique subset of folks that wants to do that, okay? I'll try it, make it worth your while. So it's my first time in Madison, Wisconsin, first time coming to Wisconsin. And I had a colleague of mine yesterday, so I told him I was going to Wisconsin, and he said, "Oh, that's great, Mike, you should wear a cheese head at the speech." I said, "That's a terrible idea for numerous reasons." Relatedly, a couple days ago, I'm driving the car. I have a 9-year-old and 11-year-old boys. And I'm driving in a minivan. Yes, I have one of those. Driving in the minivan, and as boys that age are prone to do, they're not really saying anything. We're just driving around, and it's quiet. And finally, one of them blurts out, "Dad, I have a question. If you could go to any football stadium in the country, what would it be?" No question. Lambeau Field. Okay. So hopefully I just earned some points with you all. Okay. And apparently I'm coming back to Wisconsin to go to Lambeau Field at some point. On to the business at hand. What am I doing here? What am I going to talk to you all about this afternoon? I'm here for, I would say, two reasons. Okay. First, this is no surprise to all of you. In Wisconsin, you have an outsized influence on who is going to be president in 2025. You also have an outsized influence on who is going to possibly control the Senate. There's a key Senate race that's going to take place here next year, too. So you're going to have a lot of candidates, a lot of special interests flooding this state, asking for your vote, pushing their priorities. So the first reason I'm here today is because of that fact, and I'm hoping that by the time I'm done talking to you today, wherever the federal budget and the debt like ranks maybe in your priorities, I'm hoping it goes a little higher. Okay, and if it wasn't on it at all, I hope I got it on your list of priorities. Okay, the second reason is I'm here today is to, believe it or not, try to give you some hope. Right, it's easy to despair for Washington these days and the issues they have to face. I think there's some reason for hope that we can solve some of these challenges, and I hope to talk to you about that as well. So with that, see if this works. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, hold on. I hit the wrong thing. Let's go back. Okay. Now we're good. So first, before we get into the presentation, just a little bit more about my organization, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. We are based out of Washington, D.C. I've worked there for about 10 years now, and we are a public policy organization. We've got about 25 staff. We issue reports, analyses on the federal budget and deficits and debt on a nonpartisan perspective. We work with members of Congress from both sides of the aisle and their staffs to try to advance responsible fiscal policy making. We work with the media and coalition partners to try to raise these issues. And I am happy to talk with anyone in questions or after if you want to learn more about our organization. A lot of reports, lots you can find out on our website at crfb.org. I'm going to get into now a presentation of a variety of fiscal facts, okay? We're in a campaign season here soon. Campaigns are maybe sometimes devoid of facts. Everything you're going to see here about the federal budget, this is all just from, nonpartisan, lots of government sources here. This isn't us making up the numbers. These are just the numbers, okay? So I'm going to give you the facts. Try not to bore you. There's a lot of big numbers here. But here's one point on that, too. I'm not an economist. That's not my background. We have a lot of economists in our office. I think some of the smartest people in D.C. that deal with budget issues. I didn't get into this because of those sorts of things or interest in big macroeconomic policy. I got into this because I actually think the debt deficit and budget is a foundational issue, right? To put it differently, the budget should, theoretically, reflect what our nation's values are. And the more I learned about it, the more I was pretty concerned about what it said about us as a country. And so I'm going to walk you through this now about the state of our budget, and I think you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. Okay, big picture here. The last fiscal year that just ended at the federal level, we spent about $6.5 trillion, took in about $4.4 trillion in revenue. Doesn't take a big math degree to know. We got a big gap there. About $2 trillion last year for annual federal deficit. Now, we've had consistent deficits at the federal level for several years. Okay, you can see here is a consistent gap between spending and revenues at the federal level over quite some time here. And recently, we've had some big annual deficits. Okay, you'll see here a few years ago during the COVID pandemic, we had big deficits. We had deficits upwards of over $3 trillion. Those deficits have come down, but they're still really high, near $2 trillion. We're going to go up in successive years going forward. And with deficits leads to debt. Now, let me step back here for a second. A little quick primer here. These words are often kind of thrown around, deficits and debt. Deficits are the annual difference between spending and revenues. Debt is the accumulation of all those deficits over time. When you think about national debt, you might think of big $33 trillion gross national debt. You might see it on debt clocks and different ads, and there's a big debt clock in New York City. When we talk about debt, we look at debt, we look at a metric that's a little different that you're seeing on this slide here. It's our debt as a percentage or share of our economy, okay? It's a ratio. The reason we do that is for numerous reasons. You can compare over time easier, you can compare to other countries, but most importantly, when you look at our debt as a share of an economy, it's a little bit about how you take your debt and compare it to your ability in some ways to service that debt, okay? It's not dissimilar. You have to go out and get a mortgage, right? A bank's going to look at, what your outstanding debt is, credit cards, auto loans. They're going to compare it to your income. It's a little bit similar to that, okay? You can think of it that way. If you look at this, we've had debt as a share of GDP for most of U.S. history. This goes back to the start of our country. The highest debt to GDP levels we ever had were right around World War II, when we borrowed to save the free world. They were understood, projected to, and did come down after World War II. But if you notice now, we're getting close to those levels we saw in World War II. Here's the big difference. They came down after World War II. Right now, they're projected to go and skyrocket as far as the eye can see. We're going to have deficits permanently, okay, going forward. That's going to lead to ever increasing debt. We're going to blow past that record level within the next few years and continue on an upward trajectory thereafter. Okay, so what's going on here? What's causing some of this imbalance here on spending and revenues? We're going to go here a few slides here on just what we spend our money on, how that works, okay? At the federal level, and this is high level, okay? At the federal level of the $6.5 trillion that we spend, you can see here about a little less than half, okay? In the blue on the right side here, you'll see things like Social Security, Medicare, healthcare spending. About a little less than half is on programs like that. We spend about $670 billion on interest costs on the debt, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. But then on the orange, when you see non-defense and defense spending, this is actually the portion of the budget that most people, when they even think about federal government spending, are probably the things people think of. Okay, you got defense spending, right? But then on non-defense discretionary spending is what it's called. That's where things like federal education spending go, transportation spending, spending for the Justice Department and different agencies like that, the IRS. That's where all that is, that portion, okay? Right? So that's how we spend the money broadly. Now that's what we spent just last year. Going forward, over the next 10 years, three things account for 87% of the projected spending growth in the federal budget over the next 10 years. Three things: Social Security, healthcare spending, and interest on our national debt. Those three things account for 87% of the baseline projected growth in the budget over the next 10 years. Why? Okay, why is that happening? A few reasons. Number one, it's demographics. Okay, we have an aging population. Okay, a lot of people have been entering retirement over the last decade. The baby boom generation has reached retirement age. Okay, what's going on here is there's a mismatch on the ratio of workers, okay, to beneficiaries on these programs. This chart is showing you that back in the 1950s, shortly after Social Security was created, you had 16 people working for every one person receiving Social Security benefits. That ratio has gone down over time as people have aged, as people have reached retirement, as birth rates have gone down. Okay, it's gone to 3 to 1 now. It's going to go to 2 to 1. So the aging society is putting a little pressure, okay, on some of these programs. Similarly, healthcare spending. Probably don't need to tell you all. You probably experienced this a little bit at the individual level, or businesses or families, larger companies. Healthcare costs are very high. They are big portions of individuals, companies, and governments' budgets, right? It's a very large cost for the federal government. Now, part of that is the aging society. As you age, you spend relatively more, okay, on healthcare. But also it's that healthcare costs just grow historically faster than other things have grown from a cost perspective. And so it's eating up more and more of the budget. So aging society, healthcare costs, and interest costs. Okay, I alluded to this before. We spent about $670 billion on interest on the national debt, okay, last year. Interest costs are the single fastest growing line item in the budget, okay? You might be getting a sense of this lately. Just interest costs across society have been going up lately, impacting everything from obviously mortgages to credit cards, to car loans, everything. Well, it's impacting the federal budget too, and interest costs are skyrocketing right now really, really fast. And it's the fastest growing portion of the budget. In addition, these big costs that I'm talking about, mainly Social Security, a lot of healthcare programs, interest, they're on autopilot. Now, what I mean by that is you generally have two big categories of spending at the federal level, mandatory and discretionary. They're kind of like what they sound like with those names, okay? Mandatory are programs that are largely, a lot of them are entitled, they call them entitlement programs in some cases. They are basically what they spend money on is a simple calculation of what's the benefit, how many people are getting it in a given year, and they spend it out. They don't have to decide that. They don't have to pass laws to do it each year. It just automatically happens and grows. That's what happens with Social Security. That's what happens with Medicare. That's what happens with Medicaid and some other programs. Discretionary is different. It's what it sounds like. They have a little discretion over it. It's the portion of the budget that they fight about and they debate about, okay, every year, and they have to authorize laws to do it, or sometimes, oh, let's see, the government shuts down. Okay, that's literally being debated right now, okay, in Washington, but it's actually in a smaller portion of the budget. The rest of the budget, the part that's growing, that 87% I said before, it's on autopilot. It's automatically happening every year, okay? 1970, 60+% was discretionary. That's totally flipped now. Over 70% of the budget, when you include interest, is mandatory. It's just growing automatically, okay? Let's talk about the other side of the ledger. Okay, where's the money coming in from? Everyone's favorite, taxes. Okay, about half of the revenue that we took in, at 4.4 trillion, is on individual income taxes that people pay. Another sizable portion of revenue comes from what they call payroll taxes. You look at your pay stubs, paycheck, you'll see FICA. I'm sorry, not FICA. You'll see Social Security. You'll see Medicare taxes. Okay, that come out and go into the trust fund. So those are payroll taxes. Corporate taxes are about 9% of revenues. Then a chunk of other miscellaneous revenues you can see there make up the rest of where the government gets its money from. The issue is that a lot of those sources are projected to be relatively flat from a revenue perspective. Okay, so your revenue is essentially flat going forward based on all these projected sources. What I just said about spending is not flat. Okay, that's going up automatically in large cases. And so you have basically a big structural gap between revenue that's flat, spending that's automatically going up, leading to ever-increasing deficits and debt, and ever-increasing interest costs on top of that debt. Okay? You with me so far? Okay, good. So if you're following me so far, why do you care? Why does this actually matter? Right? So it's big, scary numbers. Doesn't sound good, but why does this actually matter? Why should you care? Okay, the reality is there's actually lots of reasons, right? There's not one single reason. There's lots of reasons. I'll try and tick through a few of these right now. Inflation, okay? Everyone's become, unfortunately, a little familiar with inflation over the last few years. Lots of people think that we don't know how much, but some of the big deficits and deficits spending in the last few years contributed to some inflation. That can contribute to inflation going forward, okay? So inflation is one reason to be wary of big deficits and debt. More debt at the government level can crowd out private borrowing and investment in the economy, so it can lead to slower economic growth overall. As I alluded to before, interest rates, so more government debt can put upward pressure on interest rates in society at large, okay? Interest payments crowding out everything else. Here's a stat or a couple of stats I think will drive this home. I said interest costs are the fastest growing portion of the budget. Within a couple of years, we'll spend more in a given year on interest than we do on defense. More on interest than we do on defense. This past year, we spent more on interest in 1 year than the entire federal government spends on all programs and tax benefits that go towards kids. Interest more than kids, okay? So the more we spend on interest, some people think it's free lunch. There's no free lunch. The more you're spending on interest, there's less resources available to spend on other priorities, okay? Other missed opportunities to be able to invest in, less fiscal space to be able to respond to unforeseen economic consequences or foreign conflicts, geopolitical risk, right? We borrow our money in decent amount from other countries, sometimes from countries that may not have our best interests in mind, okay? And it's generationally unfair, right? In my opinion. We're just kicking the can down the road. These are numbers that everybody knows about. This is a problem that's going to get worse. And we're just kicking the can down the road to future generations to deal with it as well. Two other quick ones. The big programs I mentioned that are driving spending growth, Social Security, Medicare, those things, they're very popular programs, in my opinion, rightly so. they are in and of themselves, given fiscal challenges, projected to become insolvent within 10 years. So they're going to run out of money to be able to pay benefits. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. And then the last reason is, if you don't get your fiscal house in order, there is a risk that eventually folks will not want to lend you any money anymore at the rates that you'd like. And that can happen quick, that can happen precipitously, and can lead to very high skyrocketing interest costs and a recession, a deep one. Look at the history books. Plenty of other countries have been brought down by high debt levels. We're not there yet, right? We're still the best economy in the world. People still want to invest here, but it's not a smart long-term strategy, right? Based on the history of other countries. The insolvency of Social Security and Medicare I mentioned, I'm going to pivot a little bit to campaign stuff now. One of the things you've already heard in the campaign, if you pay attention to it, you're going to hear it probably a lot more. I'm not going to say from who, but let's just say it's from both sides, okay, of the aisle, is don't touch Social Security. We're not going to touch it, okay? People have earned those benefits. We're not touching Social Security. Here's the deal, right? Mandated by law, if Social Security is not adjusted on the revenue and benefit adjustments going forward to try to make them solvent, by law, it's mandated that in 10 years, there'll be automatic cuts to that program for everybody that depends on it. Automatic, 23% across the board. We did the analysis on that. Medium income family, dual income couple, that would mean about $17,400 across the board cut in their income. So the do nothing, don't talk about it, don't touch it plan is ultimately going to result in a big cut. Okay. Remember I said the second reason I came was to try and give you hope, because so far it's probably been pretty depressing. There is reason for hope on this. Here's why. So many people have known about this problem for a while. These numbers, this didn't materialize overnight. This has been stuff that's going on for a while. The thing is that Washington doesn't act on a lot of things, particularly until they kind of have to. Okay, until there's like an action-forcing deadline they have to deal with. If you're following the news at all, it's why I alluded to, like literally right now, I think they're facing the prospect of a government shutdown in a couple days, so everyone all of a sudden then starts to talk and tries to come up with things to do, okay? So you have to act when you have deadlines. Well, like I said, I've been doing this for 10 years. We've been through other presidential cycles where someone gets elected, they come in, there's no action-forcing moments that actually force them to have a conversation about it. Well, there are some now, okay? So in 2025, no matter who gets elected president, no matter who controls Congress, they're going to face some big budget, fiscal-related deadlines, okay? They're not the types of things you're hearing about actually right now in a lot of the conversation, but what you're going to see, aside from the big debt and interest costs, which they're going to face, you might have heard about the debt limit earlier this year. There was a big debate over the summer. Might have missed that we almost defaulted on our debt. People were getting pretty worried about that because we had to raise the debt limit. Well, they did raise the debt limit. They actually included some deficit reduction in it, which was a good thing. But they kicked that again to 2025, basically. So there's going to be another debt limit increase in 2025 that whoever's president in Congress is going to have to deal with. So that conversation is going to be there, right? So there's another opportunity to have a productive conversation on these issues. Another deadline in 2025 is during the Trump administration, they passed a big round of tax cuts. And because to make the math work, they had to set a bunch of those tax cuts to expire, okay, at the end of 2025. So a bunch of the tax cuts will go away. Now, do you think the politicians are going to let a bunch of the tax cuts just go away? No. But there's going to be a debate on how to extend them, how to pay for them. It's going to open up a discussion around budget and fiscal issues. So you're going to have a debt limit increase, big tax cuts expired, all happening in 2025. So again, they don't act often outside of having to. There's going to be some big fiscal deadlines facing whoever's president in 2025. It presents a big opportunity to try to force a conversation on us during the campaign of what are you going to do about this? Because you can have all the priorities in the world. This is what you actually have to deal with when you get in there. As for solutions, hopefully we have some Q&A. We can talk about solutions. On our website, we got papers upon papers on ideas on quote unquote solutions, right? What are policy ideas that have bipartisan support that can either, tamp down on spending in some areas, raise some revenue in some areas? There's plenty of solutions out there, okay? The big solutions that we need, I'm going to go big broadly here. A couple things. First, when you're in a hole, you stop digging, okay? So the one thing they got to do is anytime you have a new initiative, something you want to do, you got to pay for it. They often don't do that, okay? Much easier not to. So we need to demand that folks pay for things. That's solution number one. Seems like a simple one, but it's important. Anytime they're generating additional savings, the policies to try to dedicate to deficit reduction, then you're going to need policy solutions in some of these big areas that we're talking about. You're going to need to come up with ideas to deal with healthcare costs growth. You're going to have to come up with bipartisan ideas to deal with Social Security. You're going to have difficult conversations around revenue and taxes. If it's not obvious yet for folks that follow politics, yes, we're the people walking around telling people you got to deal with Social Security, Medicare, and more taxes. It's not a popular position, but the reality is those are the things that are going to have to be on the table. Another reason for hope here is fiscal commissions, okay? What is that? So a fiscal commission is a special group that would be set up, right? With appointed special law, like certain lawmakers, outside experts to come up with, get to negotiate, okay, deal with some tough trade-offs, make compromises, and be charged with coming up with a package to solve this in advance of those deadlines. There's actually live legislation on this right now in Congress. A group of senators just last week, Senators Manchin, Romney, 8 other bipartisan group of senators introduced a bill to create such a commission. In the House of Representatives, there's another bill very similar to create such a commission. This needs to happen to set up those opportunities for some success in 2025. So happy to share more info about that. Anyone who's interested after. That's a real opportunity to talk to legislators, senators, support a fiscal commission because we can actually get a process in place to come up with a solution. Heading towards the end here. In the campaign, kind of going full circle to what I said at the beginning, there were a lot of promises, a lot of priorities from folks coming into Wisconsin for sure. You're going to hear a lot of myths is a nice way to put it. BS would probably be a more direct way to put it, okay, on some of these issues, right? Again, lots on our website. If you're interested on this, we're going to be publishing more stuff on this of the types of mistruths/myths you're going to hear on some of these issues over the course of the campaign. I'll highlight a couple. Tax cuts pay for themselves. No, they don't. Right? Tax cuts don't pay for themselves. You can solve these issues by just eliminating waste, fraud, abuse, those kind of things. Good things to do. It's not making a dent in the size of this challenge that we're facing. We can solve this by just taxing the 1%. No, there's not enough money there. Okay, we can debate whether that's a smart thing to do. I personally think there's probably more revenue to be had there, but it's not going to solve the problem alone. Okay. And another thing to keep in mind is when you're watching politicians, other folks talk about issues like this, be wary of anything that sounds like they're just taking things off the table, okay, to talk about. So what you're seeing on this chart is if you want to reach certain goals with the budget, say over 10 years, say you want to balance the budget or you want to stabilize that debt to GDP ratio, which is what we would advocate for, right? You got to reach certain savings. We run some numbers on that. What is that? What do you got to do? Let's just hypothetically say to do it with spending cuts, just to do that. So it would take about a 26% cut across the board to balance the budget in 10 years right now, across everything. But if you start taking things off the table, right? If you start saying, which is common, right? For example, we're not going to touch Social Security. We're not going to talk about Medicare, defense, that's off the table, veterans, right? Well, now you're talking about a 76% cut to do that same thing. It doesn't work, right? So be wary of when people are starting to tell you take options off the table. I'm going to wrap up here. Hopefully we'll get some questions. This is, you could check this out on our website. This is how we're following the campaign. Okay, this is where you're going to see a lot of our analysis of candidates, the proposals they're being put forward. We do fact checking. We inject our information into the debates and past campaigns. We've had lots of different questions and things asked in debates on these issues. This is where you can find that information. If you're most interested, is go to our crfp.org website, check out our U.S. Budget Watch project. That's where we're going to have most of the relevant information. And I'm going to leave this up while we're answering questions in case you haven't been scared enough by some of the facts and figures. This is just, I probably mentioned a bunch of these facts already, but this is just a bunch of select debt facts related to these issues you can take a look at. I'll close again by just basically where I started. I've been doing this for 10 years. And some people would say that because I'm like nuts. I actually really care about these issues. I think they're important. I feel blessed to actually get a paycheck to work on something that I care about. This is a really concerning issue. You're going to be faced with, you have outsized influence in this democracy right now over the next year. I would not be surprised if debt and deficit and budget issues are not near the top of a lot of people's agenda. They're not the type of things that would be, okay, in a campaign. But hopefully I've convinced you a little bit today to consider this as an issue. You have influence. You can talk to your friends. You can talk to your family. It's only a certain amount of people in this room. That grows exponentially when you talk to people. You'll have plenty of time to do that over the next year. So I hope you'll consider this as you're thinking about who to support. And with that, thanks again for coming. I'll take questions.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Now is the time for our in-person attendees to submit your questions through the Menti link that you were given when you signed in. Feel free to start using that form, use any device, and submit questions through there. And to kick us off, we have Professor Amy Gingle from the Department of Political Science, who will ask these questions.
All right, it looks like the first question is, how does your organization function effectively as a nonpartisan organization working with so many different stakeholders and what are often highly contentious fiscal issues?
Great question. It's really hard. That's the simple answer. It's really, really hard. There's a lot of organizations. It's actually one of the reasons I'm for sure still working on this at this organization after 10 years, is there's a lot of organizations that you'll look at their website and they'll say they're nonpartisan or bipartisan. We really are. You go in our office, you got people that have voted for the total different extremes, okay, in our office. We just all really believe, because it's the numbers, okay? Again, we're just taking these numbers and putting them on a chart and talking about them, okay? We are really concerned about this. So we what's the phrase? Some people say, tell it like it is, so to speak, right? And we don't make a lot of friends sometimes, right? Depends on the week in D.C. Depends on what's going on Congress. Folks can be our friends one week, and then they don't like us another week because we're pointing out, oh, you got to pay for what you're doing right now. We're going to call you out for that. So it's kind of calling balls and strikes. That's go back to sports. On balls and strikes, and so, but it's really hard in an increasingly partisan, polarizing environment. If there's anything, I'm greatly concerned about everything I just spoke to you about. If I'm concerned about things more, frankly, it's about the health of our democracy and the growing hyperpartisanship and polarization in the country that inhibits our ability to act on some of these issues. And so when you're a nonpartisan organization in that environment, it makes it very hard.
All right, thank you. So you listed a lot of possible solutions, but what do you think is the most viable solution or solutions that would dig us out of this hole?
So I'll go through a couple. So like I said, you got to do a lot of stuff. You got to do a lot of stuff on the healthcare front. You just have to. It's just a huge portion of the budget. Now, healthcare, for anyone who's studied that, well, healthcare is incredibly complex, okay, public policy issue. It really is. But there's lots of things you can do in healthcare. And a lot of them have bipartisan support. They get kind of wonky and detailed. They'll give you one that I think is pretty simple and has bipartisan support. So right now, well, let me say this about Medicare. Medicare has different parts to it. So Medicare has Part A, Part D, Part B, okay? It's, Part A pays hospitals, Part B pays outpatient physicians, okay? What happens is they end up paying different amounts for the same procedure if it's performed at a hospital or a doctor's office. Same procedure, same resources go into it, same time goes into it, everything. But they pay different amounts. Lots of reasons why that's the case, but they do. There's proposals to equalize that, okay? So same procedure that's getting done at a doctor's office versus a hospital-owned practice, you're getting paid the same, okay? That can save money, billions and billions of dollars can save. Now, there are certain lobbies that don't want to do that, okay? But that's one, and it's an example of one. On the Social Security side of things, Social Security is very tough politically, but there's a lot of things that have been talked about in Social Security for years that probably are going to be part of some kind of solution ultimately down the line. One is it's on the tax side, right? So if everyone looks at their paychecks, you have a certain amount that comes out of your paycheck that goes through Social Security every week. It stops. When you hit a certain amount, I think it's $150,000 in a given year, it stops, right? So there's no more taken out after that, right? You can adjust that a little bit. It makes up about, it used to make up about 90% of wages, that amount they cut it off at. They just haven't adjusted it over time. We can increase that a little bit, bring in some more revenue into the program. You can even create a gap there so you can target it to even more higher off people so it doesn't have to kick in on 150. So you can play around with the revenue side on Social Security. You can play around with some inflation calculations on the Social Security side. So again, a little technical wonky, but you the way that Social Security benefits are adjusted each year by inflation, okay? The CPI index is how it's called, Consumer Price Index, how you adjust for inflation. There's an idea out there to do a more accurate measure of inflation. It's called chained CPI. Okay, very wonky. Here's the deal. It tries to take into account that if the cost of chicken goes up, well, people will stop buying chicken and might buy beef instead. Okay? Regular CPI doesn't adjust for substitutes. Chain CPI does. Okay? So now technically that might result in like less benefits because of inflation cut, or it's a more accurate measure of inflation. You take your pick. Okay? But that is a solution that's out there. Again, politically tough. But you could apply that to programs, including Social Security, that can save some money. And there's lots on the bipartisan tax reform side too. So there's a lot. I could go like for a long time on solutions, but that's a few.
All right, someone asked a related question, but given the urgent need to reduce our budget deficit, what programs make the most sense to cut in funding?
Okay. I can't stand here, and say like which program makes the most sense to cut. I just gave you a couple of the big buckets that you have to kind of look at if you're going to deal with some of the big ones. So let's almost put those to the side. You're going to have to look at some of the big healthcare programs, retirement programs, because that's where the money is. Okay, so if you want to make a big dent, unless you're slashing and completely eliminating everything else, you're going to have some reforms there. But the other thing you can look at is the Government Accountability Office. Okay, so the Government Accountability Office is another nonpartisan agency. They issue reports all the time that, I'm not going to get these numbers exactly right, but they have programs that basically are similar programs that have been set up over the years, but they're at like dozens of different agencies. So there's like a bunch of different anti-poverty programs, but there's like one doing this thing here, one doing another thing in another agency. There's a million duplicative programs. So you can consolidate, reduce. It's not massive amounts of savings there, but by reducing some of these things that are duplicative across agencies, all right, you can make a dent there as well. I'll tell you one that doesn't save money just because it's in the news. There's lots of arguments out there. People want to talk about the IRS. Well, politically sensitive these days, okay? People want to cut funding for the IRS. It's actually the one place where you get some more funding in there to get more revenue in. It goes after people that haven't been paying their taxes, right? So people that have been avoiding paying taxes, give them some more money to target some wealthy individuals to audit them. That actually brings in more revenue. So if you cut the funding to do that, it actually worsens the deficit side.
All right. Another person asked, we saw a balanced budget in the 60s and the 90s. What are the chances of the federal government coming together to accomplish this feat again?
Not very likely. No, you don't need to, actually. It's actually one of those kind of, not a myth, it's just a little bit of a misconception on this stuff. It's, look, we're for fiscal responsibility. So like if you somehow got a balanced budget, like we're not going to balance, that would be a nice thing. But the numbers are so off. To be able to get a balanced budget is so unrealistic, okay, the amount of cuts you would need. The metric you need, that's why that chart I put up there about that debt to GDP, and I kind of left it up there for a little while, that's the key. You need to, the thing that's unsustainable is that your debt is growing faster than your economy. You just need to bend that curve down. It can't just be going on an upward trajectory. You need to stabilize that so it's leveled out. Okay, that's the metric you need to look at. And that's doable within 10 years if you make some tough choices, come together on some compromises. But balanced budget, that's pretty far off.
All righty. Someone else asked, how do you define the responsible part of your organization's name?
Wait, say that again?
So what do you mean by responsible? How do you define responsible in your organization's name?
Yeah, well, it's fiscally responsible, right? So that's what we mean by that. It's actually funny. Like, well, I don't know, funny. People butcher our name all the time. Like, they butcher it. It's like such a long name. Like, frankly, like when I'm going and I go, what do you do for a living? And I have to like get some energy up to like be ready to say the name, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. People butcher our name all the time. It's like Committee for a Budget, Committee for a Responsible Government. It's terrible. We made a video of like all the people in the media just like saying the wrong name. Responsible part means fiscally responsible. We kind of just got into that a little bit in the last question. Like fiscally responsible, a lot of times might think that's like balancing the budget. No, not necessarily. Fiscally responsible might mean don't borrow at all. No, actually it doesn't, right? Fiscally responsible means being smart stewards, responsible stewards of our nation's resources. And that could change depending on the situation. It was the right thing to do, to be very clear. It was without a doubt the right thing to do to borrow a lot of money in 2020 because we needed to, right? To stop would have been a huge, deep depression, frankly, if we didn't. The problem is we borrow when we need to for bad things to stop, but we borrow in good times too. We borrow all the time, right? That's not fiscally responsible, okay? So the responsible means fiscally responsible, and it's not like maybe some of the common conceptions people mean. It's about being prudent, right? Prudent stewards of our nation's resources.
Great, thank you. Someone else asked, almost all states in the country are required and able to operate on a balanced budget. What are the budget obstacles facing Washington that prevent them from doing the same?
Oh, well, so a couple things. That's true, right? So states do, in most cases, have, with very few exceptions, have a legal statutory obligation to balance their budgets. However, for those of you that have worked in any of those sorts of issues, you'll know that there's some clever accounting maneuvers to kind of get around that, okay? In a lot of cases, it has to do with things such as like how you account for and accrue some of the pension obligations. You can kind of defer those to make it seem like you're not actually spending as much, so therefore you balance the budget, when in reality you're just actually deferring, okay, some of your pension obligations. That's just one example. So anyway, point being, yes, they do balance their budgets more, but sometimes they're not really balancing them. They don't have the borrowing authority and the treasury authority like the federal government does, right? And so the federal government's different in that regard. Why the federal government can't follow the state's leads? Look, how much time do I have, right? It's politics, right? It's politics. This is really difficult stuff. You're talking about taking things away, right? Is basically what it comes down to. Any kind of Any cut somewhere is taking something away from somebody, somewhere. That's not a political winner for somebody, right? Or you're raising taxes. Obviously not a political winner, okay? So that's why this is hard, right? Our government has really grown, it's been grown really tough to make hard choices in politics these days.
All right. How do you lower interest spending in our federal budget?
You have to lower your debt trajectory, okay? You can't just wipe it away, right? Interest is an obligation, and that's why it's somewhat another one of those mandatory programs. You have to pay interest costs. And so you can't not pay them, or you default, which is what was the concern around that debt limit that I was alluding to earlier, right? You default, that causes huge economic ramifications. So there's nothing specific to do to not pay interest anymore. You have to get your debt trajectory on a sustainable path so that it's not eating up more and more of your budget. The interest cost, that's the thing that's getting a lot of people concerned on this in the last, particularly the last several months, right? As interest costs have been going up, I think, faster than some people were anticipating across the economy. That is causing real issues at the federal level because those, like I said, those couple of stats, we're going to spend more on interest than we do on defense in a couple of years, right? And that's if they kind of stay a little bit higher than maybe projected. If they go even higher, then it gets even worse, right? The biggest risk is something that some people refer to as kind of a debt spiral, okay? But I think you'll get the concept. Essentially, the idea is that if your interest rate is higher than your economic growth rate, that can create like a vicious spiral downwards where you just have more and more interest costs, debt service costs that don't keep up with your ability to actually service it at the underlying economic growth level. And that can really lead to some of those fiscal crises that I was referring to before. So we're not there yet. The simple answer to the question is you get the debt trajectory going down, your interest costs come down too.
All right. Next question is, how can attempting to address the demographic concerns play into a possible solution? Would increased immigration, for example, allow for more gradual or smaller tax increases or budget cuts?
Yeah, so there are actually there are analyses out there that show this. Immigration, more immigration is beneficial to the budget. Okay, more immigration, it's on the revenue side. Okay, get more people coming in, more people working. The analysis there on that side of the immigration debate suggests that that would be a helpful piece on the demographic side. Okay, to in some ways account for, I guess is one way to think about it, is because of the demographic challenge. Yeah, we've had a declining, relatively speaking, workforce. A lot of people retiring. So where are you getting the workers, right? And one way to get it is through immigration. Now, immigration, to state the obvious, okay, is subject to lots of other heated discussions and debates around how to handle our immigration system that I would not pretend to be an expert on. But without a doubt, the analysis suggests that more immigration would be beneficial from the budgetary perspective.
Well, I'm going to just jump in and ask my own question because as you're talking, I've got the Washington Post on live, and they just passed a short-term funding bill to hopefully avoid shutdown. And I'm wondering, where does public opinion play in all of this? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on what's different now than in September.
Yeah, I just got a text about that myself. Okay. I was waiting to see when that might happen today. So real quick primer on this for those that might not be, and I really hope you're not, following it as closely as we have to. So that the federal budget process has been kind of limping along this whole year. To go back to what I said before, it's actually that like small portion of only the discretionary portion that they're actually fighting about, right? So the way the federal budget process is supposed to work is they're supposed to pass a budget, okay, which is the plan for how you're going to spend all this money. They're supposed to do that by April, okay? Then they set off all the appropriations committees to come up with their appropriations bills for that discretionary portion and pass all of those by September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. That's how it's supposed to work. Yeah, we haven't passed a budget, really like a real budget, in years, okay? We haven't passed all those appropriations bills, I said, on time since like the 90s, okay? the federal budget process is completely broken. And so now the way it works is they don't pass a budget at all, then try to fight over these appropriations bills. They don't get a lot of them done. They have to pass a thing called a continuing resolution. CR is what its acronym is sometimes in the news. And that just basically continues funding the government at whatever was agreed to before at the same levels. But you get to the brink of these things, when you get to September 30th and you haven't done it, if you go over that, you have a partial government shutdown. So a lot of the agencies can't get paid. They're not legally able to get paid. Important things, defense, security functions, they still happen, but all the federal government employees get to not work for several weeks. It's ridiculous because it actually ends up costing the government money because all those employees get paid when they come back anyway. And it's okay. And so they almost shut down the government in September. They didn't. They passed a continuing resolution until this Friday. Just now, it looks like they passed another one. Okay, another continuing resolution that'll fund the agencies. That they're actually doing it in two parts. They're funding some of them till January, some of them till February. So they literally, it looks like they just avoided that. 300-something votes in the House. And so it doesn't look like there's going to be a shutdown. The budget process still dysfunctional as ever.
Great, thank you. Another question someone asked was if Congress wanted to restore an expanded child tax credit in the future, how could it be financed more responsibly than the COVID-era version, which was effective in reducing poverty but very costly?
Yeah, this is a good. There's actually a lot of proposals out there to continue some expanded version of the child tax credit. So, primer for those that don't know this, in the part of the federal tax code for a long time, there's been a child tax credit. Okay, so you get a special tax credit for the amount of kids you have. During COVID, they expanded that to an expanded child tax credit, a lot more money. And that it did have a big benefit to, if you believe that's a role of government, right? Lifting a lot of people out of poverty, okay? But it was a COVID-era policy. It was set to expire, so it did. There's now talk of doing some kind of expanded version of a child tax credit again, and there are some debates going on in Washington right now. It's actually bipartisan, right? There's people on both sides that think there might be some things to do on an expanded child tax credit. This one's actually a simple answer. If something's worth doing, cool, pay for it, right? Just pay for it, right? The problem is right now there are debates going on that they might not pay for it, right? They'll do it. They'll add hundreds of billions of dollars, okay, to the debt over 10 years because it sounds good. Definitely political winner, right? They might not pay for it. So there's lots of ways. The answer to the question is lots of ways to design it. If people think it's a smart policy, you just have to pay for it. You got to figure out, have some tough conversations about how you're going to pay for it.
All right, just a couple more questions. What do you think of the recent downgrading of the United States ratings by Moody's?
So there's been a couple of downgrades. So there was a downgrade 10 years ago, like an actual downgrade. Lost our AAA credit rating from one of the rating agencies 10 years ago during a big fight over the debt limit debate back then. Over the summer, Fitch, one of the other rating agencies, the three major ones, the Fitch rating agencies downgraded the federal credit rating from AAA to AA. And then just Friday, Moody's, which is I think what you're referring to, Moody's was in the news, another rating agency. They didn't downgrade them, but downgrade the United States, but it changed its outlook to negative, okay, from stable, which it could be a precursor to them downgrading it too. So what does that all mean? There's debates going on about whether or not and how much like an actual downgrade of the rating agencies like is actually impacting, say, the cost of borrowing. Like it's not like a linear sort of relationship. If you're going to, the markets haven't, it's not clear they've reacted in that way. It's not good, right? If your rating agencies are saying that your credit rating is no longer a gold standard, and you might want to keep that in mind if you're thinking about lending the U.S. money, that's a risk, right, to the U.S. My take on this, when people have asked about it, is like there's basically two reasons, if you kind of read through the reports from the rating agencies of why they've decided to lower the rating for the United States. First, because they're on an unsustainable fiscal trajectory and they haven't done anything about it. Yeah, I agree with that, obviously. Second is our political system's dysfunctional. So they often do the downgrades, right? They did one over the summer because they were worried about what happened after the debt limit. They were watching that. They thought that was a little contentious. 10 years ago, they did it over debt limit. Right now, they're doing it because they were worried again about a shutdown. They just see these debates, this polarization, this dysfunction happening all the time. So that's why they downgraded too. So it is certainly not a good thing for the United States to get downgraded.
All right, 2 more questions. Somebody asked, how has your organization's missions been impacted given one of your members currently serves as Secretary of the Treasury?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So Janet Yellen, yeah, Secretary of the Treasury, she was a member of our board, on the board of directors, for a few years prior to her joining the Biden administration. And how has it impacted our organization? Well, having someone as great and notable when she was on our board was fantastic. She's very smart, and she's a great board member. How does it impact us now? Not at all, right? Like it's not like there's no special kind of catering to us because we have board member relationships or anything like that. We have a board of directors. If anyone wants to look at it, it's a very different in terms of its political perspectives. Our chairs are Mitch Daniels, who was a Republican governor from Indiana, among other things, and just ran Purdue University actually for a while. Leon Panetta, who was a long-time Democrat and basically is another chair and has had basically every title except for President of the United States. He was the Secretary of Defense and CIA Director and Chief of Staff of the White House and Budget Director. And we have Republicans and Democrats across our board. John Kasich, who was a Republican governor, is also on our board. So very diverse from a political perspective. It's just great to have people like that on our board, and wish her well when she goes back into service.
Great. And our final question kind of comes full circle to your introductory remarks. What difference can individual Wisconsinites make when it comes to fiscal policy at the national level?
You'd be surprised at how much influence you can actually make, right? What we hear, let me give you an anecdote. We hear a lot from members of Congress that they get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of calls, okay? Phone calls, sometimes letters, but they're like form letters. It's like a group that'll try to organize a letter and have like everyone send the same letter, okay? But they're not on things we're talking about. They are like for more things, okay? Spend on this, do this, right? More politically easy stuff in some cases. They know that these issues that we're talking about are really hard. They're not like the thing that's like going to frankly rally the whole country to come up and like have a big movement that says, now let's deal with Social Security and Medicare and maybe raise some taxes. Like that's okay. Probably not going to happen. This actually requires leadership. So sometimes what they need is they need to hear from some of their constituents. They know it's not going to be a huge amount of them relative to some of the other forces. They just need to say, you're doing the right thing. Please, like, still stand up, show leadership. And small numbers can really buck up people in that regard. So the more you talk to members of Congress, you're asking about this, you find the ones that are doing the right things, it matters. And again, from an electoral standpoint, you can make a difference. I mean, I don't need to tell you all. The margins in this state when it comes to the presidential are ridiculously tight. And yes, it's like tens of thousands. No, one person that exponentially kind of impacts a lot of people when you spread your message, okay? And so you can get other people to care about this. You can get them to talk to folks in this state and make it an issue. But I would just say, just get involved. Just get involved. Contact legislators, contact politicians, tell them to make it an issue.
All right. Thank you all again for joining us tonight. Thank you again to Mike for presenting. For our in-person attendees, please feel free to hang around, continue the discussion over some food. We also have resource tables set up, so feel free to explore those. Thank you again, Mike. This was an amazing presentation. Thanks
Thank you,
for being
everybody.
here.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.